At 39, with sealing wax cooling in its spoon and rain ticking at the pane, Adelaide Quill had done the last of her hoping. She had folded it away as carefully as other women folded wedding lace, and put it where it could not shame her by being seen. There had been no great heartbreak, no dramatic refusal beneath a summer tree. Life had simply gone on choosing elsewhere. Younger girls had become wives, then mothers, then hostesses in houses of their own, while Adelaide learned the smaller dignity of usefulness. She earned her bread by reading aloud to the elderly, to the bedridden, to widowers who could no longer bear the silence after tea. Her voice was clear, steady, and plain. It did not tremble over sorrow, and it did not preen over poetry. It served. In time she had come to think that service, if not joy, was at least a clean and orderly substitute for it. The letter that altered her course arrived on a morning that smelled of damp wool and weak coal smoke. The paper was thick, the seal black, the hand upon it severe. Adelaide broke it with the bone handle of her mending knife and found, within, an offer unlike any she had ever received. She was invited to Blackthorn Hall, seat of the Duke of Blackthorn, for the singular purpose of reading the Duchess's letters aloud. The terms were generous. The instructions were stranger still. She would attend His Grace in the library each evening. The room was to remain curtained. She was to sit by a single shaded candle. She was to read exactly what was placed before her, neither hastening nor softening a line. There was one final note, written by the steward in a hand more human than the Duke's own household script. His Grace's health did not permit bright light or unnecessary company. Discretion would be valued above all things. Adelaide read the letter twice, then a third time more slowly. The name Blackthorn Hall was known even to those who had never seen it. A vast old place, a proud house gone unnaturally still. There had been a fire some years before, a dreadful one, and since then the present Duke was said to live in near darkness, receiving no guests, venturing little beyond his own grounds, showing himself to no one without a half-mask. Gossip had embroidered what fact began, as gossip always does. Some said his injuries were monstrous. Some said he had lost his wits. Some said he mourned a mother he had loved too late. Adelaide had no taste for rumor, but she understood something far more practical. The sum offered would secure her for years if she was prudent. It would spare her from dependence upon cousins who had kindness enough for Christmas and none at all for permanence. It would, in a plain and useful way, choose her, if only for work. So she accepted. The journey north took 2 days, and by the end of the second, the world itself seemed to have dimmed. The trees grew blacker, the roads narrowed. Even the sky appeared lower, as if the clouds had descended to press upon the land. Blackthorn Hall rose from that gloom like a thing built to endure weather and sorrow in equal measure. Its stone front was immense, its windows tall and curtained, its terraces green with neglect. A fountain stood dry in the forecourt. Ivy had reached where gardeners no longer contested it. Yet nothing about the place felt abandoned. It felt watched and waiting. A grave woman in dove-gray silk met Adelaide by the door and introduced herself as Mrs. Vale, once the late Duchess's woman, now keeper of her memory as much as of the household's order. She led Adelaide through a hall that smelled faintly of beeswax, cold ash, and old roses. Their footsteps went up into a silence so complete that Adelaide lowered her own breath without meaning to. At length, Mrs. Vale paused beside a corridor where the curtains had been drawn so close that not even afternoon could enter. "His Grace keeps to the dark," she said. "You must not be alarmed by it." "I am not easily alarmed," Adelaide replied. Mrs. Vale gave her a look that was almost pity, though not quite. "No, Miss Quill, I do not think you are. But there are truths here that have not been spoken aloud in many years. Tonight, you will begin with the blue packet. And if His Grace bids you stop, you must stop at once." At the far end of that dim passage stood a pair of library doors, closed against the rest of the world. From beneath them, Adelaide could see no strip of light at all. If you would like to remain with Adelaide as those doors open, do subscribe. Mrs. Vale did not open those library doors at once. She led Adelaide first to a bedchamber in the West Range, a room plainly furnished but sound, with a narrow fire, a washstand of dark oak, and curtains so heavy they seemed to belong to winter itself. On the coverlet lay a folded gown of black bombazine, brushed and altered for her use. Beside it rested a small tray with bread, broth, and a cup of tea gone only just short of hot. Such care, in a house so withdrawn, touched Adelaide more than she expected. Blackthorn was not careless. It was wounded. While Adelaide ate, Mrs. Vale stood by the mantel and gave the last of her instructions. His Grace did not dine with the household. He kept late hours. The library fire must never be stirred once the reading began, because sudden sparks offended him. Adelaide was to avoid strong scent, bright ribbon, rustling silk, and all questions born of curiosity rather than necessity. His Grace values exactness, Mrs. Vale said. If a word is smudged, say so. If a date is uncertain, do not invent one. He has no patience for embroidery. I have never embroidered a text in my life, Adelaide answered. No, said Mrs. Vale, and this time there was the faintest warmth in her face. That, I think, is why you are here. She was taken down at the striking of 9. Somewhere in the depths of the house a clock gave out the hour in a muffled bronze voice. The corridor outside the library was colder than the rest, and the stone beneath Adelaide's slippers held the day's chill like water in a well. Mrs. Vale carried the packet tied in blue ribbon. Adelaide carried nothing but her own hands, neatly folded, and the steadiness for which she had always been paid. When the door was opened, she understood at once why the servants moved as though sound itself might bruise the place. The room was immense. She felt it before she saw it. The dark rose upward farther than the candle reached. Shelves climbed into shadow. The smell was leather, old paper, banked ash, and something else beneath it, a faint bitter trace, as of timber once burned and long since shut away. At the center stood one table under a green shade, so that the light fell downward and nowhere else. Beyond that small pool of gold, the rest of the library remained in eclipse. Then he spoke. Miss Quill. His voice came from the far side of the table, low and level, yet worn thin by disuse. Adelaide turned toward it and made out the shape of a man seated slightly back from the light. She could see his hand upon the chair arm, pale against the dark wood, and the hard gleam of one signet ring. When he leaned just enough for the lamp to catch him, she saw the line of his jaw, the severe cut of his mouth, and the black edge of a half-mask covering the upper portion of one side of his face. The uncovered eye regarded her with grave attention, as if he were judging not her prettiness, which no one had ever done first, but her capacity to endure this room without foolishness. Your Grace, she replied. You have been told the terms of your employment? I have. Then we may spare one another ceremony. Sit. Read what is before you. When I require you to stop, I shall say so. There was no rudeness in it. There was no gentleness either. Adelaide sat, untied the blue ribbon, and laid the first sheet flat beneath the lamp. The paper was cream, the hand strong and slanting, each line written by a woman accustomed to being obeyed. The late Duchess's letters had the presence of their owner even in silence. Adelaide drew one breath and began. My dear Eleanor, the rain has fallen for 3 days without interruption, and my son has taken to prowling the north corridor like a soul under sentence. The chair opposite hers made the slightest sound, more like the tightening of a body struck where no one else could see. Adelaide kept reading. The Duchess's voice on the page was brisk, amused, alive. She spoke of wet roses, failing chimneys, a cook offended by nutmeg, and a duke who pretended indifference to everything while secretly correcting the arrangement of books on a side table no guest ever noticed. There was wit in it, affection too, the sort that reveals itself by accuracy. She had reached the end of the second page when His Grace said, very quietly, "Read that sentence again." Adelaide lowered her eyes to the line. She read it once more. In the pause that followed, she heard something she had not expected from the master of Blackthorn Hall. A breath, caught hard, and mastered harder. Then, from the darkness beyond the green lamp, came 5 words that changed the whole shape of the night. There should not be that letter. Adelaide did not answer at once. She kept her finger on the line she had just spoken and listened to the silence that followed it. The fire in the grate gave a small inward sigh. Somewhere high in the shelves, old timber settled with a dry tick. Across the table, the Duke had gone so still that he seemed less a man than a dark shape cut from the room itself. At last, she said, "The sheet bears the same hand as the others, Your Grace." "I know whose hand it bears." His reply came quickly, almost sharply, and then his tone lowered again. "That sentence about the side table, there should not be a letter containing it. My mother wrote to her sister of such trifles. She did not write them to Eleanor Marsh." Adelaide looked down at the page. The name at the top was indeed Lady Eleanor Marsh. The seal had been broken long ago, but neatly, by someone accustomed to preserving what mattered. "Then the packet was mislaid before it reached me," she said. "No." He drew one breath, as if mastering impatience with himself rather than with her. "No, Miss Quill. The packets were arranged by year, by hand, and by recipient. I gave those orders myself. If this letter is here, it was placed here after the sorting. The words might have invited gossip in another house. At Blackthorn, they invited caution. Adelaide knew better than to ask who had altered the papers. Instead, she said, "Shall I continue?" For a moment he did not speak. Then he inclined his head, just enough for the edge of a half-mask to catch the lamplight. "Yes, read to the end." She obeyed. The remaining page was mild enough, full of domestic wit and a brief complaint about drafts in the north corridor. Yet the warmth she had first heard in the late Duchess's letters was changed for Adelaide now. It no longer felt like elegance preserved in paper. It felt immediate, almost dangerous, because it had reached into the dark and touched a nerve still alive. When she finished, Julian Arden did not dismiss her. He asked instead for the date, then the postmark, then the watermark in the lower corner. Adelaide held the page close to the lamp and answered as plainly as she could. He knew all 3 before she spoke them. That much was clear from the way his fingers tightened on the chair arm. At length he rose. The movement was noiseless, but it altered the whole balance of the room. He was taller than she had thought, leaner, too. The black coat hung with severe elegance, and the visible side of his face was arresting in its restraint. Mouth firm, chin uncompromising. The scarred side remained mostly hidden, yet Adelaide could feel its presence in the care with which he held himself away from the light. He came no nearer than necessity required, and took the letter from her by one edge. "My mother wrote this 3 months before the fire," he said. "It should have been in a green packet, not a blue. Mrs. Vale would never make such an error." "Then someone else handled it?" "Yes." He stood looking down at the page, though Adelaide doubted he saw the words. "You will say nothing of this?" "Of course, Your Grace." His gaze lifted to hers then, direct and cold and tired all at once. "That was not a test of your discretion, Miss Quill. It was a necessity." "I understood it as such." Something in her answer checked whatever further command had risen to his lips. He gave a short nod and turned away. "Come tomorrow at the same hour. We will proceed with the blue packet as planned." Adelaide thought the interview ended. She had almost reached the door when he spoke again, not to her back, but into the dimness between them. "If you find anything misplaced," he said, "anything at all among the letters, you are to bring it first to me, before Mrs. Vale, before the steward, before any soul in this house. Do you understand?" Adelaide rested her hand on the brass latch. It was cold as winter water. "I do." "Good." She opened the door. The corridor beyond seemed strangely bright after the library, though only one wall sconce burned there. Mrs. Vale was waiting in its narrow light, hands folded, face unreadable. "Well?" she asked softly. Adelaide had scarcely drawn breath to answer when she saw, on the tray beside the housekeeper, another packet waiting for the morrow, tied not in blue, but in faded green. Adelaide looked from Mrs. Vale's face to the faded green ribbon and understood two things at once. First, the Duke had spoken true. The letters had once been ordered by color, with a care too exact for accident. Second, the housekeeper had not expected her to notice. The tray trembled very slightly in the older woman's hands, though her voice remained composed. "You are chilled, Miss Quill," Mrs. Vale said. "You had better go up." Adelaide did not move. "His Grace believed a letter was placed wrongly after the packets were sorted." Mrs. Vale's eyes, pale in the weak sconce light, rested on her for a long moment. "His Grace believes many things where his late mother is concerned." "That was not my question." "No," said Mrs. Vale softly. "It was not. There are houses, if you have ever known one, where the truth does not vanish. It is merely carried from room to room by the people who survive it. Blackthorn was such a house." Adelaide felt it now in the hush between them, in the faint smell of starch and candle grease, in the way even the draught in the corridor seemed to hesitate before passing on. At last Mrs. Vale set the tray upon a side table. "The green packet should have been read first," she said. "Years ago, before the fire, Her Grace wrote often to Lady Eleanor. Afterward, some things were altered." "By whom?" "I cannot answer that in a passage." It was refusal, yet not dismissal. Adelaide followed her to a smaller morning room nearby, long unused except for pressing linen. Its windows were shuttered, and dust lay upon the harp in the corner like gray velvet. Mrs. Vale closed the door behind them. In that stale, fabric-scented room she seemed older than before, less official, more tired. "When His Grace first commanded the letters brought down," she said, "he gave exact instructions: year, recipient, seal. He wished for order because he could not endure memory without it. But when the first bundles were taken from Her Grace's escritoire, there was contention." "With whom?" "With me." Adelaide said nothing. Silence, she had learned in other sick rooms, was often more useful than inquiry. Mrs. Vale folded her hands. "I had served the Duchess since she came here a bride. I knew her hand, her moods, her small habits of concealment. There were letters I believed too private to be used in this manner, like instruments laid out for a surgeon. His Grace insisted upon everything, nothing withheld, nothing softened. In the end, the steward sided with him. I yielded. Yet before I yielded, I removed one packet." "The green?" "Yes." "Why?" The older woman looked toward the shuttered window, though there was nothing to see there. "Because those letters were different, earlier, warmer. They were written to the sister Her Grace trusted most. They spoke of the Duke when he was still a son in her mind, and not merely a man under duty. I thought, if he began there, the pain would be greater." Adelaide considered that. It had the shape of kindness and the result of harm. So you altered the order. I postponed it. Mrs. Vale's mouth tightened. A foolish distinction, perhaps, but one clings to the furniture of one's conscience. That, Adelaide thought, sounded like the Duchess herself. The next day Blackthorn remained under the same dim sky, yet Adelaide noticed more than she had before. A cracked urn on the terrace held dead yew clipped into old form. A footman crossing the hall glanced toward the curtained north passage and lowered his eyes at once. The house was not merely neglected. It had taken its habits from one injured man and arranged itself around his suffering. Even the servants had learned to dim their steps. When evening came, Adelaide entered the library alone. The green packet already lay beside the lamp. The fire had been built lower than on the previous night, and the room smelled of peat, leather, and the faint medicinal scent of extinguished wax. Julian Arden stood by the mantel instead of sitting. The light touched one cheek and left the other in measured shadow. The black edge of the mask made his stillness seem sterner than it was. "You spoke with Mrs. Vale," he said. It was not a question. "I did, Your Grace." "And?" "She told me the packet was withheld once. She said she feared its contents." His hand, resting on the mantel, closed slowly. "For whom?" "For you." He gave one short, humorless breath that might once have been laughter. Then she knew precisely what she was about. "Sit, Miss Quill." Adelaide drew out the chair. His next words came after a pause, low, exact, and harder to hear than any raised voice. "Tonight, you will read the green letters, every line. And if my mother loved me more plainly there than elsewhere, I would know why that kindness was taken from me." Adelaide untied the faded ribbon with careful fingers. The silk had gone soft with age, and one edge was darkened as if it had once lain too near smoke. The first page beneath it was older than the others she had handled, the paper thinner, the ink a warmer brown. She settled it beneath the lamp. The fire gave off a low red glow from the grate, and the rest of the library waited beyond the table like a chapel after evening prayer. Julian had resumed his chair, though he sat more upright than before, as if every muscle in him had drawn close to listen. She began. The letter was unlike the one from the previous night. It had none of the polished wit meant for society. It was intimate from the first line. The Duchess wrote of her son at 20, newly come into duties too large for his years, still carrying mud on his boots because he had spent the morning in the lower fields speaking with tenants himself when the steward had failed to appear. He was proud, grave, and far too ready to take blame where burden would do. She wrote that he had once risen from supper because a kitchen maid was crying in the passage, and had stood outside the servants' hall until someone kinder than himself was found to comfort her, because kindness in him ran deep, but embarrassment ran deeper. Adelaide read each sentence plainly. She did not lift her eyes, yet she could feel the stillness opposite her grow more charged with every line. At the close, Julian spoke at once. "That is enough." His voice was controlled, though only just. Adelaide laid her hand on the second letter in the packet and waited. He did not tell her to leave. Instead, he said, after a little while, "She had no business preserving such observations." "Your Grace?" "My mother." A faint scrape of cloth told Adelaide he had turned his head away from the light. She was exact with everyone. She did not indulge tenderness on paper. Adelaide thought of the page before her. The Duchess had indulged nothing. She had merely seen. "It appears she trusted Lady Eleanor with what she would not speak aloud elsewhere." He gave no answer to that. The silence lengthened until Adelaide believed the reading would end there, cut short by something too private to endure. Then he said, "Continue." The next letters deepened rather than eased the matter. One described his dislike of flattery while still a young man. Another told of a winter fever in the village and of Julian sending wood from his own stores without waiting for the chaplain's list. A third, written after some disagreement between mother and son, was sterner. The Duchess said he had inherited his father's iron self-command and none of his father's vanity, which should have made him easier to love, but in truth made him harder to reach. At that, Julian asked for the line again. Adelaide repeated it. His uncovered eye remained fixed upon the darkness beside the hearth. She understood then that these letters were no comfort in any simple sense. They did not soothe him by saying he had always been admirable. They revealed instead that he had long been known in those awkward generosities, those severe habits, those private mercies he had perhaps imagined invisible. For a man who had spent years hiding even his face, the exposure of his younger self must have felt almost indecent. After the fourth letter, Adelaide turned the page and found a smaller sheet tucked within the fold. It had not been sealed, only slipped there, and the handwriting was more hurried than the rest. She paused. Julian noticed at once. "Why have you stopped?" "There is an enclosure, Your Grace." "Read it." Adelaide held it closer to the lamp. The words were cramped toward the bottom, as if the Duchess had run out of space and patience together. "My dear Eleanor, if my son ever asks to see these letters, I pray you let him have them when he is gentle enough to bear the truth of being loved." The Duke rose so abruptly that his chair struck the carpet behind him, and in the same instant the flame beneath the green shade shivered. The lamp flame steadied, though the room did not. Julian had risen so fast that the legs of his chair bit into the carpet and left crooked furrows there. He stood with one hand flat upon the table, the other drawn back against the shadow, as if even now he distrusted what light might reveal. Adelaide did not speak. She kept the small enclosure between her fingers and waited for his command. At last he said, in a voice so low it seemed dragged from somewhere painful, "Read that sentence again." She obeyed. "My dear Eleanor, if my son ever asks to see these letters, I pray you let him have them when he is gentle enough to bear the truth of being loved." No answer came at once. The coal in the grate gave a soft crack. Outside the curtained windows, the wind pressed faintly against the glass. Julian turned away from the table and stood facing the dark shelves, his head bent a little, as if the very shape of those words had struck him across the mouth. When he spoke again, the control was back, but only just. "She wrote that of me?" "She did, Your Grace." "Gentle enough." He repeated it with no bitterness and no amusement either, only weariness. "My mother always had a genius for saying the most merciful thing in the form of a reprimand." Adelaide lowered the paper. "Shall I continue?" He let out one breath. "No, not yet." Then, after a pause, "Miss Quill, when you read to the dying, do they always hear what is intended?" The question was so sudden and so unlike the ones he had put before that Adelaide lifted her eyes. His visible profile was hard against the dimness, but his mouth had changed. It looked tired and younger for the tiredness. "Not always," she said carefully. "Some hear comfort, some hear what they fear. Grief is a poor listener." "And guilt?" She considered him before she answered. "Guilt is worse. It alters the words before they arrive." He was silent at that. Adelaide thought she had gone too far. Yet after a long interval he returned to the chair, seated himself, and gestured once toward the packet. "Finish the rest." The remaining pages were brief. They spoke of weather, of a cracked coping stone in the orangery, of Lady Eleanor's tiresome lapdog, of nothing that ought to have carried weight. But the small enclosure had changed the air. Every sentence now seemed to Adelaide like part of some larger truth still hidden from them both. When she came to the end, Julian did not ask for any line repeated. He only took the folded enclosure from her hand and looked at it for a long while without unfolding it again. The dismissal, when it came, was gentler than any order he had yet given. "You may go, Miss Quill." She rose. At the door he said, "Tomorrow you will not attend me in the evening. Mrs. Vale will bring you to my mother's writing room after luncheon. There are further packets yet unsorted, and I would have your eye upon them." "My eye, Your Grace?" "You observe without disturbing the dust." A faint pause followed. "It is a rare gift in this house." That night Adelaide slept little. The words, gentle enough to bear the truth of being loved, moved through her thoughts like a bell sounding through fog. No one had ever spoken thus of her, or to her. She had spent so many years training herself to want little that the sentence seemed almost extravagant. She wondered what it had done to a man who had hidden half his face from the world. The next afternoon, Mrs. Vale led her not to the library, but to a small inner room lined with satin-wood cabinets. The late Duchess's writing table stood near the window, its surface polished, its drawers labeled in a neat old hand. The air smelled of lavender paper, old sealing wax, and the dry sweetness of faded violets trapped in a bowl. Several bundles had already been set out for Adelaide to examine. Some were tied, some loose, some merely stacked by size. She began with the smallest, sorting by hand, date, and seal, as she had been asked. Half an hour passed in quiet work. Then, at the back of a shallow drawer that seemed at first empty, her fingers touched a single envelope roughened at one corner. She drew it out. The edge was singed black. The seal had melted and hardened again in an ugly blister. And on the front, in the same firm hand she now knew too well, were written only 4 words: "My son, if found." For a few moments Adelaide did nothing at all. She held the singed envelope in both hands and listened to the little sounds of the late Duchess's room, as though the dead woman herself might forbid or permit what came next. The house was quiet at that hour. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window a rook called once and was answered from farther off. The scent of lavender had gone dry with age. Beneath it, fainter and uglier, lingered a trace of old smoke released from the scorched paper as it warmed beneath her fingers. "My son, if found." No date, no recipient beyond that, no instruction. Adelaide knew very well what duty required. She had promised Julian that anything misplaced among the papers would be brought first to him. The promise had been plain, yet the thing in her hand did not feel like a misplaced household document. It felt like the last live coal in a ruined hearth. If she placed it in his hand unopened, she might be giving him peace. She might also be placing a weapon in it. A man who had already twisted so much against himself could twist this too, if its contents were not what hope imagined. She set the envelope down upon the blotter and stepped back from it, as though distance might restore judgment. It did not. After a moment, she drew open the nearest drawer, thinking to secure it there until evening. Inside lay a little seal press, a bundle of quills, and one glove of pale kid folded into itself. That small relic of the Duchess's hand undid her. With nearness. The room was full of unfinished presents. Whoever had written that last envelope had done so in haste, perhaps in pain, perhaps in smoke. Adelaide's throat tightened. She broke the seal. The paper inside had been folded twice and opened never. One corner was blackened through. The ink had blurred in a few places where heat or damp had touched it, yet most of the hand remained clear. Adelaide stood by the window, though the shutters gave no real light, and read, "If you survive, and I do not, you must never believe that I died accusing you." She sat down hard in the Duchess's chair. The letter was brief, breathless in places, but entirely lucid. The Duchess wrote that the fault was not his alone. She named the chimney in the gallery, long warned over and too long neglected. She wrote that Julian had come back for her when others cried out against it. She wrote that if he carried blame after that night, he carried what did not belong to him. Most piercing of all, she wrote with a mother's terrible economy. I leave this world loving you. Do not make of my death a punishment and call it devotion. Adelaide read those lines twice, then once more, slower, feeling each word settle into her like weight. The room seemed altered around her. The satinwood cabinets, the neat labels, the dry flowers in their bowl, all of it belonged now to a final act of mercy that had somehow failed to reach its object. 10 years of darkness, and this had lain in a drawer. A soft knock made her start so violently that the page slipped in her grasp. "Miss Quill?" Mrs. Vale's voice came through the door. "His Grace has sent to ask whether you have found anything of note?" Adelaide looked at the letter, then at the blistered envelope upon the blotter. In that instant she understood the burden of being the one through whom truth might pass. If she spoke now, everything changed at once. If she concealed it, even for a day, she entered the very secrecy that had poisoned this house. She folded the sheet with trembling care and slid it back into its cover. When she opened the door, Mrs. Vale stood in the passage with a ring of keys at her waist and searching eyes lifted to Adelaide's face. "Well?" the older woman asked. Adelaide heard her own voice answer, steadier than her pulse. "Yes, I have found something." And at that very moment, from the far end of the corridor, came the unmistakable sound of Julian Arden's step approaching before the hour he ever left the library. Adelaide had only time to slip the singed envelope into the fold of the nearest ledger before Julian reached them. His step was not hurried, yet it carried decision with it. He came along the dim corridor in a dark coat, one gloved hand at his side, the line of his shoulders rigid beneath the cloth. He wore the black half-mask as always beyond the library, and the narrow windows gave him no kindness. Mrs. Vale lowered her head. Adelaide did not. She could not. Her pulse was beating too hard against the secret now hidden inches from her hand. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "you may leave us." The older woman hesitated. It was slight, but Adelaide felt it. Then she dropped a curtsy and withdrew without a word, keys whispering against her gown as she went. Julian's gaze moved to Adelaide. "You have found something?" "Yes, Your Grace." "What sort of thing?" It would have been easy, so terribly easy, to speak at once, to place the blistered envelope in his hand and let fate have its way. But the words she had read still rang through her with too much force. If she gave him that letter here, in a corridor, between a ledger and a locked drawer, she would be offering him a blow, not a mercy. She chose the smallest truth that was not a lie. "A paper set apart from the others. It appears to have been hidden rather than mislaid." His jaw tightened. "By whom?" "I cannot say." He looked at her for a long moment. The visible eye, cool and pale beneath the shadow of the mask, missed very little. "And you did not bring it to me at once." The sentence landed without anger, which made it more dangerous. "I was interrupted by Mrs. Vale before I had time to judge what it was." "Judge," he repeated softly. "That is a bold verb in my mother's rooms." Adelaide felt the rebuke and accepted it. "Then I will choose a plainer one. I had not yet decided whether it required your hand or your hearing first." Something changed in his face. It did not soften, it sharpened into attention. "Explain yourself." So she did, as clearly as she knew how. She said that some writing wounds more when thrust at the eye than when given its proper voice. She said that over sickbeds and deathbeds alike she had learned this much. Words meant for the heart do not always arrive there if fear reaches them first. Julian heard her without interruption. The corridor stood hushed around them. Behind him, the curtained window admitted only a poor, gray light, yet even that seemed more than he liked. At length he said, "You presume a knowledge of my fear." "No, Your Grace, only of language." He stared at her then, with a look so direct it seemed almost a touch. Adelaide had been overlooked by men all her life, dismissed kindly, consulted practically, passed by without malice and without regret. To be observed in earnest, even under censure, stirred something restless and long unused inside her. She held herself still beneath it. "Very well," he said at last. "Bring whatever you have found to the library tonight, sealed, unread if possible." The last phrase was deliberate. He was testing her. Adelaide lowered her eyes. "As you wish." He gave one short nod and turned away, but after 2 steps he halted. "Miss Quill." "Yes, Your Grace?" "When you read to the grieving, do you always decide what they are fit to hear?" "No." She met his gaze again. "Only whether they are fit to hear it alone." Since she had come to Blackthorn, she saw surprise disturb his composure. It soon passed. Yet it had been there. That evening the library felt changed before a word was spoken. The fire had been lit earlier and burned lower, filling the room with the smell of peat and iron. The green-shaded lamp threw its usual narrow pool upon the table. Adelaide placed the singed envelope there between them, unopened in appearance, though her heart knew otherwise. Julian sat already waiting, his posture exact, his face half lost in shadow. He did not touch the letter. "Read the scheduled packet first," he said. Adelaide obeyed. The pages concerned ordinary matters: roof slates, a cousin's tiresome visit, a broken latch in the west nursery. Yet the object between them drew all breath toward itself. Julian listened too intently to be hearing sense. Adelaide heard herself read and knew he was marking every pause. At last she came to the end of the final sheet and folded it closed. The silence after it was so complete that the clock on the far mantel could be heard taking its next minute. Julian extended his hand toward the singed envelope, then stopped short of touching it. "Miss Quill," he said very quietly, "before I decide whether that is to be placed in the fire or opened, tell me one thing only. Did my mother write it in anger?" The question rested between them with more weight than the sealed paper itself. Adelaide looked at Julian's outstretched hand, at the singed edge of the envelope under the lamp, and knew there was no longer any shelter in caution. One answer would send the letter to the fire. The other might open a door that had been barred for years. "No," she said. He did not move. "No," he repeated. "She did not write in anger, Your Grace." His fingers withdrew a little, not quite from the letter, but from the impulse to destroy it. The room held its breath. The peat gave a low red sigh in the grate. Somewhere in the wall, wind worried faintly at the stone as though the night itself wished to hear what would happen next. "You are certain?" It was hunger forced into discipline. Adelaide chose her words with care. "I am certain of the temper of the hand. The lines are hurried, some are marred, but there is no violence in them." He lifted his eyes to her face. "Then you have read it." She had known the moment would come. Even so, the admission burned her cheeks. "I did." He rose very slowly this time, as if sudden movement would spoil what little command he possessed. When he was standing, the lamp threw light upon the plain side of his face and left the masked side in darkness. That division had begun to seem, to Adelaide, like the shape of his whole life. One part presented to the world, one part abandoned to shadow. "You disobeyed me," he said. "Yes." "Why?" There was no point now in hiding behind excuses. Because it was addressed to a son, and I feared you might meet it first as a judge." For one sharp instant she thought she had gone too far. His mouth hardened. The hand nearest the letter closed into itself. But he did not dismiss her. He did not raise his voice. He only stood looking at her, and something very old and tired showed through the sternness. "Do I strike you?" he asked quietly, "as a man much given to mercy?" Adelaide answered before prudence could interfere. "No, Your Grace. That is why I feared for you." Silence followed, the kind that alters what will come after it. Julian lowered his gaze to the envelope once more. When he spoke, his voice had lost the edge that accusation had given it. "Tell me one thing more. Is it a letter a mother ought to have her son hear from another mouth?" The question pierced her, not because it was weak, but because it was not. It came from a man who had spent years refusing witness, and who now, for the first time, was asking whether he must bear a wound alone. "Yes," Adelaide said, and this time her voice gentled of its own accord. "I believe it is." He stood motionless for so long that she began to hear the small ticking of the mantel clock again. Then he sat down, though not with ease, and drew the letter toward him with one finger. He did not break the false appearance of the seal. He merely rested his hand over the paper as if testing whether it was real. "Read it," he said. Adelaide did not reach for it. "Your Grace, if I do, I must tell you plainly that what follows cannot be unheard." A faint, bleak curve touched his mouth. "Miss Quill, nothing in this house has ever been unheard, only avoided." She unfolded the singed sheet with care. The crackle of the paper seemed unnaturally loud beneath the green shade. Her own pulse had grown so strong she feared it might shake her voice, but when she began, it held. "If you survive, and I do not, you must never believe that I died accusing you." Julian shut his eyes. Adelaide read on. She read the Duchess's words about the chimney long left dangerous, about his turning back for her when others cried against it, about blame that had fastened itself where it did not belong. She read every line as it had been written, with no ornament and no mercy added by her own hand, because the mercy was already there. When she reached the sentence, "I leave this world loving you," his head bowed. Then came the last line, "Do not make of my death a punishment and call it devotion." Julian's hand fell from the letter to the table. For a moment, Adelaide thought he had not understood. Then he said, scarcely above a breath, "Again." And when she lifted the page to begin once more, he reached up with unsteady fingers to the fastening of his mask. His fingers paused at the fastening, and then fell away. Whatever impulse had moved him there, it did not complete itself. The mask remained where it was, a dark boundary between what the room was permitted to see and what it was not. Adelaide, who had half risen without knowing it, slowly sat again. The singed page trembled once in her hand and then grew still. "Again," he said. So she read the letter from the beginning. This time he did not shut his eyes. He listened as a man might listen at a deathbed door, hearing his own name spoken within and fearing the tone of it more than the words themselves. When she came to the line about the chimney, his mouth tightened. When she came to the line about his turning back for her, his hand closed over the arm of the chair. And when she read, "I leave this world loving you," something in his expression altered so nakedly that Adelaide looked down at once, as one does when a prayer is spoken aloud by accident. When she had finished, he held out his hand. She placed the letter in it. He took the page with grave care, though the hand that received it was unsteady. For a little while he said nothing. The fire settled. The clock breathed onward. Blackthorn itself seemed to listen. At length he spoke, but not to Adelaide. "The chimney. The word came out as if he had been arguing with it for years. "She names it," Adelaide said quietly. "Yes." His gaze remained fixed on the paper. There were complaints about smoke in the West Gallery that autumn. Twice, perhaps 3 times. I ordered the masons sent, then delayed him. There was rain, then hunting guests. Then my mother said the matter could wait. A faint, strained breath left him. It appears we were both wrong, and I have spent 10 years permitting myself the greater share. Adelaide heard the old habit in that sentence at once. Even absolution, placed in his hand by the dead, was being measured for how much blame he might still retain. She chose her reply with care. "Your Grace, a burden is not made nobler by being carried past the point of truth." His eyes lifted to hers. The green shade cast half his face in amber and left the rest in obscurity. "Do you instruct all your employers in this manner, Miss Quill?" "No, Your Grace." "Why me?" "Because you have asked to be hurt correctly," she thought. "Because you have lived so long with punishment that mercy arrives like insult." "Because I do not believe anyone else in this house has dared answer you plainly." But what she said was, "Because your mother did." For a moment she feared she had offended him. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It was the slightest thing, hardly more than the ghost of acknowledgement, but it transformed him more than any full smile might have done. "You are impertinent," he said. "I am exact." "Yes," he answered, and that strange, near smile was gone. "So you are." He folded the letter once, very carefully, along its old crease. "Mrs. Vale must see this." Adelaide's heart gave a small start. "Now?" "Now." He rose and crossed to the bell-pull by the mantel. There are silences that become indecent when prolonged. The words were clipped, yet something had shifted. A room that had held only grief and ritual now held judgment, and perhaps the first faint stir of action. When Mrs. Vale entered, summoned from the passage, she stopped short at the sight of the singed page in Julian's hand. The color left her face. "So," he said, "you knew." Mrs. Vale pressed her fingers together. "I knew there had been a last letter. I did not know where her Grace had hidden it." "You suspected?" "Yes." "And you let me build a theology of guilt upon that uncertainty?" Adelaide had never heard his voice like that. It was not raised. It did not need to be. Mrs. Vale, who had withstood him for years, looked suddenly as frail as tissue held too near a flame. "I tried to spare you," she whispered. "No, you tried to postpone me." The older woman's eyes filled, though she did not weep. "I feared what any final word from her might do if it hardened what was already hard in you." Julian stood very still. Then he held out the letter. "She loved me," he said. "She says so plainly, and I have spent a decade hearing accusation where none was given. You will tell me, Mrs. Vale, all you remember of that night, everything omitted, everything softened, everything." Mrs. Vale stared at the page as if it might burn through her merely by being seen. When she spoke, her voice had gone thin. "My lord, if I tell you everything, I must begin with what happened in the gallery before the fire ever started." Mrs. Vale did not speak at once. She stood just within the circle of lamplight with her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. The old woman had served this family too long to fear raised voices. It was the quiet in Julian that alarmed her. Adelaide saw it plainly. The singed letter lay on the table beside his hand, and the whole room seemed gathered around it, waiting to learn whether grief would harden again or yield at last. "What happened in the gallery?" he asked. Mrs. Vale drew a careful breath. "Your Grace had quarreled with her Grace that evening." Julian did not flinch, though Adelaide saw his mouth set. "I know that much." "Yes, but you do not know the cause as I understood it." Mrs. Vale lifted her eyes from the hearth to his face. The Duchess had received grave advice from her physician some weeks before. She concealed it from almost everyone, from the steward, from me as long as she could, and from you longest of all. Adelaide felt the air change. It was a small thing, perhaps, merely the fire settling, yet the whole room seemed to lean toward those words. "My mother was ill," Julian said. "She was dying," Mrs. Vale answered, and there was no softness in the truth. "Not that night. Not within the week, perhaps, but soon enough that she began setting her affairs in order when no one watched." Julian's hand tightened over the chair arm. "Why was I not told?" "Because she feared what your love would do to your judgment." Mrs. Vale swallowed. "And because pride, my lord, is no less pride when it wears a mother's face." The confession struck harder than any accusation could have done. Adelaide watched Julian's expression alter by degrees, first disbelief, then anger, then something far deeper and more wounded than either. He turned his head slightly away from the lamp, but he did not retreat into shadow as he once would have done. Mrs. Vale continued, more quietly now. "That night in the gallery she meant to tell you. I am certain of it. She sent for the old portrait of your father to be taken down. She said she could not bear his face above the mantel while leaving you in ignorance below it. You argued. She was sharp with you. You were sharp with her. I heard only part, but enough." The older woman's fingers shook once and then steadied. "You told her she trusted everyone with burdens except the one person bound to carry them beside her." Adelaide lowered her gaze. The words were too intimate, too raw, and yet she could feel their truth. They belonged to the same man who had spent 10 years carrying blame beyond the limits of reason simply because it was something to carry. "And she?" Julian asked. Mrs. Vale's voice thinned. "She said that if she gave you one more duty, you would mistake it for love and refuse yourself the ordinary grace of being her son." Silence followed. Long silence. You could hear the tick of the clock, the hush of peat collapsing inward, the faint stir of the curtained air. Adelaide did not move. She had read to the grieving before. She knew the moment when sorrow ceased to be a story and became a room one must stand in. At length Julian said, "Go on." Mrs. Vale obeyed. The Duchess, she said, had insisted on remaining in the gallery after the quarrel to oversee the shifting of the portrait and the moving of a pair of old screens stored too near the chimney breast. Julian had left in anger, then paused in the north passage when he thought he smelled smoke. By the time he turned back, a curtain lining had caught. Servants ran. Someone shouted for water. The Duchess was trapped beyond the fallen screen, and Julian had gone in after her when others hesitated. That part, at least, the letter had confirmed. "When they dragged you out," Mrs. Vale whispered, "you were conscious only long enough to ask whether she lived. No one dared answer. By morning the surgeons had done what they could, and your mother—" Her voice failed a little. "She was gone before dawn." Julian did not look at either woman. He stared into the low fire as if all 10 lost years might be recovered there if he looked hard enough. Then he said, so quietly Adelaide barely heard him, "She meant to tell me. That was the quarrel." "Yes, sir." "And I left her in anger." Mrs. Vale took one involuntary step forward. "You came back." The words hung there, simple and terrible. Julian stood. The movement was abrupt enough that Adelaide's own breath caught. He took up the singed letter and folded it into his coat with slow precision. Then he turned toward the windows, toward those heavy curtains that had kept out day after day, year after year. When he spoke again, his voice was level, but something fierce had awakened beneath it. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will see the gallery with my own eyes." The words remained in the library long after they were spoken. "Tomorrow I will see the gallery with my own eyes." Mrs. Vale bowed her head, and Adelaide felt, with a strange clarity, that something had shifted in Blackthorn which would not shift back. The house had grown used to his refusals. It did not yet know what to do with his resolve. That night, no more letters were read. Julian dismissed neither woman immediately, yet conversation had run its course. He stood by the curtained windows with the singed page inside his coat, and Adelaide, gathering the scattered papers into their proper order, felt almost as though she were tidying after a storm that had broken indoors. At the door, he said, without turning, "Miss Quill, you will attend me in the morning." "In the morning, Your Grace?" "Yes." The word itself carried its own astonishment. Morning did not belong to him. Mrs. Vale glanced up sharply, but said nothing. Adelaide slept little. Dawn came, pale and slow, through the chink in her curtains, and with it the sounds of a house waking more fully than before. Somewhere below, shutters were being opened in a room long kept dim. She heard them, one by one, wood, hinge, metal latch. A footman crossed the flagged court outside with a coal scuttle. The air in her chamber held the clean chill of early light and the faint scent of damp stone. By the time Mrs. Vale came for her, Adelaide was already dressed. "He is in the east corridor," the older woman said. "The east?" Mrs. Vale gave the briefest nod. "He would not have it put off." They found Julian, not in shadow, not hidden in the library, but standing before a tall window whose curtain had been drawn back only halfway. Morning entered in a narrow sheet across the floorboards and caught the dust in the air. He stood just beyond the brightest reach of it, gloved hands behind his back, face turned toward the strip of day, as if it were an adversary he meant to meet without yielding. He wore the black mask still, yet even so the sight of him there unsettled Adelaide. It was the first time she had seen him where the sun might have touched him if he had taken 2 steps more. "You are punctual," he said. "I was summoned early, Your Grace." A faint sound escaped him, something near laughter. "So you were. Mrs. Vale, you will have the key." The gallery lay beyond 2 disused rooms and a passage lined with Holland-covered furniture. No one seemed to have crossed that way in months. The air was colder there, with the stale, shut smell of old plaster and extinguished fires. Mrs. Vale unlocked the door and stood aside. Julian did not move at once. Adelaide, close enough now to hear the change in his breathing, understood that courage in such moments rarely resembles ease. It resembles stillness, and then one step taken because someone must take it. He entered first. The West Gallery was longer than Adelaide had imagined, and stranger. Repairs had been done after the fire, yet not lovingly. New plaster broke the old pattern on the walls. One portion of the floor had been replaced with plainer boards than the rest. The far end, beneath a high chimney breast, bore a smoke-dark bloom no scrubbing had wholly erased. Dust lay on the sills. The tall windows were filmed with age, turning the morning light to a gray wash. The room smelled of stone, soot long settled, and damp wool from the coverings shrouding abandoned chairs. Julian went straight to the chimney. "This was it," he said. No one answered. There was no need. He stood before the blackened section of wall for so long that Adelaide's eyes moved elsewhere, not from discomfort, but to grant him privacy in the midst of witness. She saw the marks where a large portrait must once have hung. She saw a warped brass fender. She saw, half hidden behind a rolled carpet against the wall, the narrow frame of an old folding screen with one panel charred through at the edge. Then Julian spoke again, more quietly. "She was standing there when I left her." Adelaide turned back. He had reached up, perhaps without thinking, to loosen the fastening near his temple. Whether from heat, strain, or the simple forgetting of habit, the clasp gave way beneath his fingers. The half-mask slipped. And in the pale, merciless light of the gallery, Adelaide saw his face fully for the first time. No one spoke. The pale light from the high windows did what candlelight never had. It showed everything at once, and without mercy. One side of Julian's face remained as Adelaide had first known it, severe, finely made, controlled. The other bore the old work of flame across temple, cheek, and jaw, the skin drawn and whitened in places, darker in others, one line running down toward his throat where the collar hid the rest. It was not ugliness that struck her, it was pain made visible. Pain, and the long discipline of having lived beneath it. The loosened mask hung by one fastening against his shoulder. Mrs. Vale made a small sound and turned away at once, more from grief than shock. Adelaide did neither. She saw the instant Julian understood what had happened. His whole body went still. The hand nearest his face lifted, then stopped halfway, as if he no longer knew whether covering himself would be dignity or surrender. Adelaide's own heart had leapt hard enough to hurt. Yet years spent among the sick and grieving had taught her this much. The face one makes in another's wound becomes part of the wound itself. So she kept her own quiet. No pity in it, no startled softness, only attention, steady and human. "The fastening has slipped, Your Grace," she said. Her voice sounded almost ordinary in that cold room. Thank God for that. Julian looked at her. It was a long look, searching, unbelieving perhaps. He had expected horror, Adelaide thought, or that more courteous violence which people call kindness when they cannot bear their own discomfort. He found neither. He found a woman speaking of a practical inconvenience because she refused to make a spectacle of his scars. Slowly, without taking his eyes from her, he let his hand fall. Mrs. Vale, recovering herself, stepped forward at once. "My lord?" No. The word was quiet, but it stopped her. He reached up and unhooked the mask entirely. "No, leave it." The air changed again. Adelaide felt it like the shift before rain. He had stood in daylight, barefaced, before only 2 witnesses, yet the act had the force of some public declaration. He turned back toward the blackened chimney breast, his scarred profile clear now against the washed light. "This is what I brought out of the gallery," he said. It was not self-pity, it was testimony. Adelaide moved closer by a single pace, no more. "And yet you came out." His mouth tightened. "By chance." "By effort," she answered. Mrs. Vale pressed a hand to her lips. Julian said nothing. But he did not rebuke Adelaide, and that silence mattered. They remained in the gallery another quarter of an hour while he questioned Mrs. Vale about the position of the screens, the servants who had first run for water, the order in which the doors had been opened. It was not the old self-tormenting inquiry Adelaide had begun to recognize in him. It was clearer than that. Grimmer, but clearer. He was not asking how to condemn himself. He was asking what had truly occurred. At one point he touched the smoke-dark wall with his fingertips and stood with his head bowed. Adelaide thought he prayed. Then she realized he was merely breathing, deeply and with effort, as if teaching his body that this room belonged to the present again. When at last they left the gallery, he did not replace the mask. The return through the east corridor felt uncanny. Servants shrank back at the sight of him, and then, seeing that he did not command retreat, bowed so low they almost vanished into themselves. Julian took no notice. The light from the windows struck the scars full on. Adelaide walked half a step behind, not shielding him, not displaying him, simply keeping pace. Mrs. Vale followed in stunned silence. At the library door he halted and turned to Adelaide since the mask had fallen. "You did not look away," he said. No, Your Grace. Why? The question was different from the others. It held no challenge, only naked uncertainty. Adelaide answered before caution could tame her. Because I saw you. Something flickered across his face then. Pain, gratitude, disbelief. She could not have named it. He opened the library door himself and stood aside for her to enter first. Inside, the room seemed darker than ever after the gallery's thin day. The green-shaded lamp waited unlit upon the table. The curtains were still drawn. Yet when Julian crossed to the windows, barefaced, he did not at once turn away from them. Instead, he laid a hand on the nearest curtain and began, very slowly, to pull. The curtain moved with a dry whisper across the rod. Dust stirred in the narrow seam of daylight it admitted, and for one suspended instant neither Adelaide nor Mrs. Vale spoke. The light that entered was thin, winter-pale, and yet in that room it looked almost bold. It struck the carpet in a long bar, touched the leg of the reading table, caught the brass edge of the green lamp, and came to rest just short of Julian's boots. He stopped there. He simply stood, with one hand still on the curtain, and regarded the strip of light as a man might regard a river he has sworn never again to cross. His face, bare now, showed the effort of such a small act more plainly than any declaration could have done. Adelaide remained where she was. She understood that witness, to be kind, must not crowd. Mrs. Vale recovered herself first. "My lord," she said softly, "shall I have the shutters opened in the morning room as well?" Julian did not answer at once. His gaze remained on the floor where the daylight lay. Then he said, "One room at a time, Mrs. Vale. Let us not make a spectacle of competence." The dryness of it was so unexpected that Adelaide almost smiled. So, she saw, did Mrs. Vale. The old woman bowed and withdrew, carrying her astonishment with her. When they were alone, the library seemed at once larger and more intimate. The drawn curtain had altered its proportions. The high shelves still loomed. The curtains on the farther windows remained shut. Yet the place no longer felt wholly surrendered to night. Julian came back to the table and looked at the unopened packets waiting beside the blotter. "We will read this afternoon," he said. "Not tonight." Adelaide had learned enough of him to hear the significance. "In daylight, Your Grace?" "In what little this season permits." He touched the stack of letters once, almost absently. "My mother has made a nuisance of concealment. It appears I must answer in kind by permitting illumination." There it was again, that dry wit, so long buried beneath severity that it startled her each time it rose. Adelaide sat because he had not told her to go, and after a moment he seated himself opposite. The pale bar from the window did not reach him, but it lay near enough to alter the color of the air between them. He studied her a little. "You are wondering whether I regret the gallery." "No, Your Grace." "What then?" She considered him before replying. "Whether it cost you more to stand there, or more to remain?" His mouth changed, something more inward than a smile. An unfair question. "You need not answer it." "I think," he said slowly, "that remaining cost more, which is perhaps the reason I have avoided the experiment for so long." The honesty of it landed between them with quiet force. Adelaide folded her hands in her lap to keep from fidgeting. She was very aware suddenly of her own plain gown, of the worn kid at one fingertip of her glove, of being a woman who had spent years becoming useful rather than noticed. And yet here she was, sitting alone with a duke whose face the county had not seen in full for years, being answered as if her thoughts were worth the labor. He broke the silence first. "Miss Quill, how long have you read to the bereaved?" "Since my father's death, more or less. It began by necessity." "And continued by choice?" "By aptitude," she said. That drew the faintest sound from him, a breath that may once have been laughter. You are mercilessly exact in your distinctions. I find them useful. Yes, he said. So do I. The afternoon reading was shorter than their evenings had been. The light faded quickly, and Julian's endurance with it. Yet he did not ask for the curtains to be closed. Adelaide read from a packet of the duchess's letters, written in the months before her illness had worsened, letters less raw than the last revelations, but newly alive now in their small domestic observations. A complaint about the library's chill, a note on the steward's indolence, a tart remark concerning a sermon too long for human charity. Twice Julian asked her to repeat a line. Once he corrected a date. Once, when his gaze drifted to the pale window, he missed the next sentence altogether and asked her to begin the page again. She did so without comment. When the light failed at last, it left the room softly. No one had to pull the darkness in. It came of its own accord, as evening does in houses where long habits are being unlearned. Julian rose, walked to the curtain, and stood with his hand on the cloth. Adelaide thought he meant to close it for the night. Instead, he said, still facing the window, "Tomorrow I must see the tenants' petitions. Dawson has let them accumulate." "That is sensible, Your Grace." "It is overdue." He turned then, and in the dimness his scarred face looked no gentler than before, but far more human. "You will sit with me while I read them." Adelaide looked up in surprise. He seemed to notice, "Unless you object to practical company." Before she could answer, someone knocked sharply at the library door, and the steward's anxious voice carried through the wood. "Your Grace, there is a family from the lower cottages asking if you will receive them tonight." The knock seemed louder than it ought to have been, perhaps because the room had grown so used to smaller sounds, paper turned, coal settling, one careful voice carrying another woman's words out of the past. Julian did not flinch at it. That, more than anything, told Adelaide how much had changed. A week earlier he might have sent the steward away unanswered. Now he stood by a half-open curtain in the failing light and said, "Who is it, Dawson?" The steward's voice came through the door again, strained with uncertainty. "The Brindle family, Your Grace, from the lower cottages. Their youngest is unwell, and the roof over the back room gave way in the storm." Julian's expression hardened, though not in refusal. Adelaide had begun to learn the differences in him. There was the old hardness, turned inward like a blade. And there was this, a tension sharpened by responsibility. "Why was the roof not repaired when the petition was first submitted?" he asked. A pause, then, "I believed it could wait until spring, Your Grace." Julian shut his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the last pale strip of window light touched the scars at his temple and cheek, and he did not turn away from it. "You believed wrongly. Show them into the morning room. I will come there directly." Dawson hesitated again. Adelaide could almost hear the man's discomfort through the wood. "Your Grace, shall I have the shutters drawn?" "No." The word landed like a dropped weight. When the steward's steps retreated, Julian remained still for a moment, one hand resting on the back of his chair. The library had grown dim enough now that the seam of day at the curtain no longer held dominion. The green lamp and the fire had reclaimed the room. He looked at Adelaide. "You heard." "Yes, Your Grace." "I had intended to review the petitions with you tomorrow." "Then perhaps tomorrow has arrived early." A faint, surprised breath left him. He did not quite smile, but the severity around his mouth eased. "You make difficulties sound almost orderly." "Only the manageable ones." He crossed to the table and gathered the loose letters into a neat stack, his movements more deliberate than graceful. "Will you come with me?" The question took her unawares. "To the morning room?" "Yes." He set the papers aside. "You have a way of hearing the practical part of distress before others drown in it. If I am to begin correcting the negligence of my own house, I should prefer someone present who does not tremble before rank or sentiment." It was one of the plainest compliments Adelaide had ever received, and for that very reason it struck deep. Her whole life had trained her to expect usefulness, not preference. To be asked, specifically, intentionally, stirred something in her chest that was both warm and perilous. "If you wish it, Your Grace." "I do." The morning room had not, in truth, seen many mornings of late. It was smaller than the library, with pale walls, a low fire, and 3 tall windows looking east over the neglected terraces. Tonight, only one pair of shutters stood open, leaving the room lit by a modest fire and the last wash of evening. Mrs. Vale had the foresight to send in tea before withdrawing. The Brindle family stood together upon the hearthrug, father, mother, and a little boy wrapped in a blanket, though he was old enough to stand on his own legs. Their boots were muddy. The mother's hem was wet to the calf. All 3 stopped short when Julian entered, barefaced. Adelaide saw the moment of shock. Then she saw something better. The father bowed. The mother dropped a curtsy, with the child's small hand clutched in hers. No horror, only awkwardness and need. Julian motioned them up. "Speak freely. I have kept you waiting too long already." That, too, was new. The father explained the roof, the rain coming through, the bedding spoiled, the child's cough worsened by damp. Julian listened without interruption. Adelaide, seated a little apart near the escritoire, noticed what the man did not say as much as what he did. He had petitioned twice. The first request had gone unanswered. The second had been marked deferred in Dawson's hand. She saw Julian notice the same omission. His face did not change, but his attention narrowed. "How many cottages in the lower row remain unrepaired?" he asked. The father glanced helplessly at his wife. "3, Your Grace. Ours is worst." Julian turned to Dawson, who had stationed himself near the door with the anxious look of a man discovering that old habits may soon be expensive. "3, the Duke repeated. "Yes, Your Grace, though the estimates—" "Bring me the estimates." "They are in the estate office." "Then fetch them." Dawson bowed and went, too quickly to preserve dignity. The little boy coughed then, a rough, chesty sound into his blanket. Julian looked at him, and something in his scarred face altered. Recognition. "Mrs. Brindle," he said, "your family will sleep tonight in the old schoolroom wing. It is dry, and the fires can be lit within the hour." The mother's eyes filled at once. "Your Grace." Julian raised a hand, cutting off gratitude before it could become performance. "It is not charity. It is correction." He turned slightly, as though to ask Adelaide whether that had been rightly put. But before he could speak, Dawson returned with a packet of accounts and one loose paper at the top, a petition in the late Duchess's own hand, written months before the fire, warning that the lower cottages would not survive another hard winter if repairs were delayed. No one in the morning room seemed to breathe. The loose paper lay across the top of Dawson's bundle like an accusation that had waited years for the right hand to uncover it. Julian took it first. Adelaide saw the instant he recognized his mother's writing. His thumb paused over the margin. The Brindle child coughed again into the blanket, small and harsh, and that sound, more than anything, brought the room back into motion. "Mrs. Brindle," Julian said, without lifting his eyes from the page. "Mrs. Vale will see you settled in the schoolroom wing, dry bedding, broth, a fire kept through the night." The woman bent into a trembling curtsy. Her husband attempted speech, failed, and bowed instead. Julian did not invite thanks. He only inclined his head once, and when the family had been led away, the room felt colder for their absence. Then he read. Adelaide watched the words move behind his eyes. The petition was brief, practical, written long before the fire, and wholly in keeping with the Duchess whose letters she had come to know. It named 3 cottages in danger of failure. It warned that delay would cost more than timely repair. It ended with a sentence so sharp and clear, Adelaide could almost hear the dead woman speaking it aloud. A house is judged less by the height of its windows than by whether rain falls upon the children of those who serve it. Julian lowered the sheet. "When was this submitted?" he asked. Dawson swallowed. "Near 2 winters before her Grace died." "And no repairs were done?" "Only temporary patching, Your Grace. Funds were—" "Do not say constrained." His voice remained level, but it had gone cold enough to frost the room. "I have just read my mother's warning with my own eyes. If funds were constrained, then priorities were corrupt." Dawson colored. "I acted as seemed prudent at the time." Julian set the paper down with exact care. "Prudence that leaves tenants wet in winter is merely neglect, taught to use a gentleman's word." Adelaide sat very still. She had seen anger in many forms. This was not rage, it was judgment. And because it was governed, it cut deeper. He turned to her then. "Miss Quill, you heard the Brindles. How many practical facts did the man actually give us?" The question startled Dawson more than it did Adelaide. She answered at once. 3 cottages in the lower row are compromised. Their roof has failed at the rear. The child's cough is worsened by damp. 2 earlier petitions were ignored or deferred. Julian nodded once. "And what is missing?" "The state of the other 2 cottages, the materials needed, and whether the family stores were spoiled by water." Dawson shifted where he stood. Julian did not look at him. "There, Dawson. You see why I asked Miss Quill to remain?" The steward bowed stiffly. "Yes, Your Grace." "You will go tonight with Hale from the yard and inspect the whole lower row. You will report before breakfast. Mr. Brindle's stores will be replaced from the estate granary at once. If the child requires a physician, one will be sent." "Yes, Your Grace." "And tomorrow," Julian added, "you will bring me every deferred petition from the last 5 years. Every one." Dawson's face changed. He had expected reprimand, perhaps, but not excavation. 5 years, my lord?" "All of them." When the steward had gone, carrying his dread with him, the room fell quiet again. Firelight moved over the silver tea things. Outside, evening had darkened the terrace glass to mirror. Julian remained standing, the Duchess's petition in one hand, his mother's fire night letter hidden inside his coat, and Adelaide felt with sudden force how closely the dead woman still guided this house. He looked at Adelaide in a way he had not before, directly, as if forgetting for a moment that he was a duke and she merely the woman employed to read aloud night after night. "She saw it all," he said. "Yes." "And I made a religion of one failure while 100 lesser failures bred in the dark around me." Adelaide answered gently. "Then light serves more than one purpose, Your Grace." His gaze held hers. There was fatigue in it, and pain, but something else had entered too, something like recognition. After a long pause, he moved to the nearer window and put his hand to the shutter latch. The last of the servants had not yet closed the outer court for night. A little wind pressed at the casement. He stood there a moment, as if measuring himself against one more threshold. Then he opened the shutter fully, and, from the drive below, the sound of carriage wheels broke the quiet. A visitor had arrived at Blackthorn unannounced. The sound of wheels on gravel seemed to travel through the whole house. Blackthorn had been so long withdrawn that any arrival after dusk carried the force of intrusion. Julian remained by the open shutter, one hand still on the latch, while Adelaide watched the last color fade from the terrace beyond. Somewhere below, a groom hurried across the yard. Then came the muted thud of a carriage door and the quick exchange of voices at the entrance. Dawson, still lingering with his bundle of papers, looked as though he wished himself invisible. Julian turned from the window. "Who was expected?" "No one, Your Grace." "Then someone has either lost his road or mistaken my habits." He set the Duchess's petition carefully upon the escritoire. "Which is more likely, do you suppose, Miss Quill?" Adelaide, who had by now learned the difference between his bitterness and his wit, answered, "That depends upon whether the visitor is hopeful or foolish." A small pause followed. Then, unexpectedly, Julian gave a brief, low laugh. It altered his whole face, not enough to erase the scars, nor to soften his gravity, but enough to remind her that warmth had once belonged there, and might again. The sound startled Dawson more than the carriage had done. Before any of them could speak further, the butler appeared at the door, grave as ever, though a touch less imperturbable than usual. "Your Grace, Reverend Harbury and his daughter request the honor of a word. Their horse cast a shoe 3 miles from the village. They beg pardon for the late hour and ask whether shelter may be had until the smith can be sent for at first light." Julian's expression did not close, but it sharpened. "The Reverend is here?" "Yes, Your Grace." Adelaide knew the name. Every estate had such figures, those who carried parish news, village sorrows, baptisms, burials, and all the frayed cords by which great houses remained tied to ordinary lives. If Julian received him tonight, and received him barefaced, that fact would not remain private for long. He knew it too. She saw the knowledge pass over him. "Show them in," he said. Dawson made a tiny, involuntary movement, almost a flinch. Julian noticed. "You look troubled, Dawson." "Only concerned for your Grace's comfort." "My comfort has governed this house long enough." The steward bowed and withdrew at once. A minute later the Reverend entered with his daughter beside him, both wind-touched from travel. Harbury was a gentle, silver-haired man in a plain black coat gone shiny at the seams. His daughter, Miss Harbury, carried a traveling cloak, damp at the hem, and the composed air of a woman accustomed to managing other people's unease before they named it. They both halted upon seeing Julian clearly in the lit room. The daughter's eyes widened only slightly. The father recovered first and bowed. "Your Grace, I fear we impose." "You do," Julian said. Then, after the briefest pause, "but not unpardonably. You will stay the night." Relief touched the clergyman's face. Miss Harbury curtsied and thanked him with admirable simplicity. She did not stare. Adelaide, watching the exchange, felt a quiet stirring of pride that made no practical sense at all. He was doing it. One threshold after another, not gracefully perhaps, not easily, but truly. Introductions followed. Julian named Adelaide without awkwardness or concealment. "Miss Quill is assisting me with family papers." It was a sparse explanation, yet one that placed her in the room by right, not accident. Miss Harbury greeted her with easy courtesy. No one thought to dismiss her. Tea was ordered afresh. Reverend Harbury, once seated, began at once to apologize again for the intrusion, but Julian cut through it with unusual patience. "Sir, if your horse had chosen a less symbolic hour to fail, I might have been offended. As it is, Providence appears determined that I resume the habits of civilization all at once." The Reverend blinked. Then, to Adelaide's secret delight, he smiled. Conversation moved carefully at first. Parish matters, winter roads, the state of the chapel roof. Julian listened with a focus that had nothing of his old evasion in it. If anything, he seemed almost severe in his attention, as though determined not to waste the chance to rejoin the common fabric of the world. Miss Harbury spoke once or twice on behalf of the village school. Her tone was practical, her mind quick. Adelaide saw Julian note both. Then the Reverend, with the innocent cruelty of the well-meaning, said, The county will be glad indeed to hear that Blackthorn is no longer shut against the light." A stillness followed that all four of them felt. Julian did not retreat. He did not summon the mask he no longer wore. He only looked toward the half-open shutter and answered, "The house has been badly governed by shadows." Miss Harbury lowered her eyes at once, as if granting him dignity in the moment. Her father murmured something gentle. Yet Adelaide felt, more keenly than before, what such small encounters would now begin to cost. This was no longer merely a private healing in a dark library. The world was coming back. And, as if to prove it, the butler entered once more, carrying a silver tray with the evening post. On the top lay one thick cream envelope sealed in red wax. "From Lady Winifred Ashcombe, Your Grace," he said. "Marked urgent." The red seal seemed almost indecently bright against the butler's silver tray. Julian took the envelope at once, though not with eagerness. Adelaide, watching from her chair near the hearth, saw recognition pass over his face before he had even broken the wax. Lady Winifred Ashcombe was no stray correspondent. She was one of those women who kept 3 counties informed of themselves and thought it public service. He opened it and read in silence. Reverend Harbury, who possessed tact enough to know when it was required, rose slowly and said, "If your grace will excuse us, my daughter and I have already trespassed far beyond courtesy." Julian lowered the paper. "You have done no such thing. Mrs. Vale will see you settled. The schoolroom wing has fires now." He stood as they bowed themselves out, and Adelaide noticed that he did not, even in distraction, retreat from the lamplight or reach for a mask that was no longer at hand. When the door had closed behind the Reverend and his daughter, the room felt suddenly narrower. The letter remained in Julian's hand like a challenge. "Well?" Adelaide asked at last, because he had grown used to her not pretending indifference where practical knowledge was needed. He looked at her with a curious expression. "You assume I mean to share it." "I assume only that if Lady Winifred writes at such an hour and marks it urgent, the matter concerns more than her own comfort." That nearly smile touched him again, brief and unwilling. "Miss Quill, your confidence in the triviality of other people is one of your more refreshing qualities." He handed her the letter. It was written in a handsome, vigorous hand and crowded to the margins, as if Lady Winifred had much to say and no patience for a second sheet. She had learned, she wrote, from Reverend Harbury's housekeeper's sister's boy, who had seen lights at Blackthorn later than usual and the east shutters unbarred, that his Grace was receiving visitors again. If the report were true, she begged that he would not refuse the small assembly she and Sir Matthew Ashcombe were to hold at Ashcombe Court in 10 days' time for the benefit of the village school and infirmary fund. His presence, she added without shame, would restore courage to many timid souls who had long ceased hoping to see the Duke of Blackthorn in company. There followed 3 paragraphs of warm insistence, 1 practical appeal to charity, and 1 astonishing sentence underlined twice. "The county must learn that you are among the living." Adelaide folded the letter and returned it. Julian's mouth had hardened while she read. "My mother admired Lady Winifred because she never mistook intrusion for hesitation. She appears to continue the family tradition." He gave a soft sound that was almost laughter, then moved to the fire and stood with one arm upon the mantel. The flames touched the scarred planes of his face and threw the rest into bronze and shadow. "An assembly," he said. "How efficiently the world sharpens its knives when it hears one has opened a window." Adelaide understood at once what lay beneath the dryness. It was not dread of conversation or even of gossip. It was the old terror given new clothes, the fear of being seen all at once, by many eyes, with no dark room to master the terms of it. "You need not answer tonight," she said. "No. But if I decline, the refusal itself becomes news." That may be true. He turned his head slightly. And if I go? She did not speak at once. She thought of the gallery, of the slipped fastening, of the tenants in the morning room, of the Reverend's startled kindness. Then of herself, a woman of 39 who had long ago made peace with the thought that no life would ever turn because she had entered it. Yet this one had. Quietly, almost against reason, it had. If you go, she said carefully, they will look, some with curiosity, some with pity, a few with decency, but they will also see what you have not permitted them to see for years, that you are still master here. Julian was silent. The fire settled inward. Beyond the half-open shutter, the night wind moved through the bare branches along the terrace. At length he said, "And what would they see of you, Miss Quill?" The question caught her wholly unguarded. "Of me, Your Grace?" "Yes." His gaze held hers with unsettling steadiness. "You speak as though I would go alone. I do not think you have understood your place in this matter." Before she could answer, there came another knock, swift, urgent this time, and Mrs. Vale entered without waiting to be summoned. "My lord," she said, breath short from haste, "the child from the Brindles has taken a bad turn. He is asking for you." Julian moved before the last word had left Mrs. Vale's mouth. The letter from Lady Winifred was set aside unread for the moment in all but its first sting, and the morning room, with its half-open shutter and cooling tea, fell behind them as they crossed into the corridor. Adelaide rose and followed without being asked. By now she understood that the child's distress was not merely a tenant matter. It was part of the same reckoning that had begun in the library and spread outward through the house. The schoolroom wing smelled of hurried heat, newly lit fires, damp wool steaming dry, broth, and the sharp sweetness of honey stirred into hot water. In the chamber at the end of the passage, the Brindle boy lay propped against pillows too large for him, his face flushed, his breathing quick and rough. His mother knelt by the bed with a cloth in her hand. His father stood helpless near the hearth, cap twisting between his fingers. The boy's eyes, bright with fever and fear, fixed at once upon Julian. "There now," Adelaide heard him say, and the words came more gently than she would once have believed possible from that grave mouth. "You sent for me." The child nodded, then coughed so hard his whole small body bent with it. Julian crossed the room at once and sat on the edge of the bed as if he had done such things all his life. Perhaps he had, before grief narrowed his world. Adelaide moved to the table where the untouched broth stood and tested it with one finger. Still warm. Mrs. Vale had done what she could. The physician had not yet arrived. He thought he'd be sent out again," Mrs. Brindle whispered, shame and exhaustion warring in her face. "He woke and would not rest until he knew Your Grace meant us to stay." Julian looked down at the child. "No one will send you out tonight." It was a simple promise, yet in that room it sounded almost sacred. Adelaide saw then what the boy had wanted: certainty. A child's body may burn with fever, but often it is fear that keeps it from settling. She poured a little water into a cup and brought it over. Julian looked up as she came, and without any ceremony at all took the cup from her hand. He supported the boy's shoulders while Adelaide held the cloth ready. Between them, they coaxed a few swallows down. The child slept soon after. Not deeply, but enough that his breathing eased. Mrs. Brindle wept then, in the quiet way tired women do, face bent, shoulders shaking once. Julian rose from the bed and stepped back, as if embarrassed by gratitude before it was even spoken. When they had left the chamber, Mrs. Vale remaining behind to watch through the night, Julian stood in the passage with both hands braced upon the window ledge. The casement there was old and did not wholly close, so a little seam of cold air touched his face. Adelaide stayed a few feet away. She had learned that some moments asked for nearness, some for room. He asked for me, Julian said at last, almost as though to himself. Yes. I had done nothing yet. Tonight you did? He turned his head slightly. Miss Quill, you are inconveniently resistant to despair. I have found despair an idle use of energy. That earned her the briefest flash of warmth in his eyes, then it faded into thought. When Lady Winifred writes of the county learning I am among the living, I suspect she imagines an assembly and a supper table. It had not occurred to me that being alive might first be required here. Adelaide looked past him through the dark pane. The terrace lay black under the winter sky. Farther out, one lantern moved where Dawson and the yardman must be on their inspection of the lower cottages. The whole estate seemed in motion at last, though quietly. It is required in both places, she said, but one teaches the other. He was silent for a time. Then, with a weariness that held no self-pity in it, You must think me very slow. The remark, so unexpected and so human, touched her deeply. I think you have been alone too long. His gaze settled on her then, and something in it made the passage feel smaller than it was. And you, Miss Quill? Have you been alone too long? The question entered her more swiftly than she could defend against. She might have given him some neat answer about work or habit or the usefulness of solitude, but those would all have been half-truths, and he had begun, in his grave, difficult way, to ask more than half-truths of her. Yes, she said. He looked at her as though the word mattered. At that very moment, footsteps came quickly along the corridor, and Dawson appeared, mud at his hem and a folded paper in his hand. Your Grace, he said, breath short, I have the report on the lower cottages, and another matter besides. A message rode in from Ashcombe Court. Lady Winifred says she means to call here in person tomorrow if no answer is sent tonight. Dawson's report on the cottages remained forgotten for a moment, eclipsed by the threat of Lady Winifred herself descending upon Blackthorn. Adelaide saw at once that the message struck Julian in two places at once, at his old aversion to scrutiny, and at his newly awakened sense that retreat was no longer entirely his to choose. He held out his hand for the report first. The cottages. Dawson blinked, then passed over the folded sheet. Julian read it, standing in the passage outside the schoolroom, with the low murmur of Mrs. Brindle soothing her child on the other side of the door. The details were as Adelaide had expected, and worse in their accumulation. 3 roofs failing, a cracked flue in the second cottage, rot in the lintel of the third, long neglect covered by short excuses. Julian's face grew stiller with every line. These repairs begin tomorrow, he said. No estimates, no deferments, timber from the north stores, slate from the old stable yard if it can be reused soundly, and new if it cannot. Yes, Your Grace. And Hale is to sleep no more tonight than I do if the first cart is not loaded before dawn. Dawson bowed. He seemed almost relieved to be employed rather than pardoned. As for Lady Winifred, Julian added, folding the second message between his fingers, she may call tomorrow if she must. She will find me at home. Dawson's eyes rose involuntarily to his face and then dropped again. Very good, Your Grace. When the steward had gone, the corridor quieted. Only the small domestic sounds from within the schoolroom remained. A spoon against china, the creak of a chair, a child's eased breathing. Adelaide looked at Julian. You have invited Battle to breakfast. I suspect Lady Winifred usually brings her own artillery. He slipped the messages into his coat. Yet, if I am to begin receiving people, perhaps it is best to start with those who never learned the meaning of no. The dry line should not have moved her as much as it did, but it was not the wit itself. It was the ease with which it came now, the sense of a mind no longer clenched wholly around pain. They walked back slowly toward the library. The house was quieter than before, but no longer dead quiet. Fires had been lit in rooms long left cold. A maid crossed the far end of the corridor, carrying clean sheets. Somewhere a door opened and shut. Blackthorn, which had held its breath for years, had begun, very cautiously, to breathe again. At the entrance to the library, Julian stopped. The curtain he had drawn back earlier was still open by that narrow measure, and moonlight now lay where daylight had been. Adelaide was used to the room's darkness, yet this thin silver across the floor changed its whole character. It was less a hiding place now than a chamber waiting to be altered. "Sit," he said. There was no reading table ceremony in it tonight, no command to untie ribbon, no packet laid between them. Adelaide sat by the fire. Julian remained standing for a moment, then took the chair opposite, though not before adding another log to the grate with his own hand. It struck her again how small practical acts in him felt newly significant. He was rejoining his own life, piece by piece. After a silence, he said, "You answered me in the passage." "I did." "When I asked whether you had been alone too long." Adelaide folded her hands together to keep them still. "Yes." "And you answered as though it were a fact, not a sorrow." She considered that. "Some sorrows grow quieter if they are named plainly." His gaze rested on her face with unsettling steadiness. "Have you made yours quiet, Miss Quill?" It was the sort of question no one had asked her in years. People asked whether she was comfortable, whether she would take tea, whether a chapter might be continued. They did not ask after the shape of her private resignation. She had arranged herself too neatly for that. "I have tried," she said. "And succeeded?" She thought of the many small economies of the heart by which a woman survives, hopes folded away, expectations thinned to usefulness, tenderness spent on others because there is nowhere else for it to go. "No," she said at last. "Only managed." Something softened in his expression then. She would have known pity at once and hated it. This was nearer to recognition, to kinship perhaps, though she hardly dared name it so. Before he could speak again, the door opened and Mrs. Vale entered with a lamp. She paused, taking in the uncurtained seam of moonlight, the Duke seated without concealment, Adelaide opposite him as if she had every right to be there. "Forgive me, my lord," she said. "The Reverend's daughter asks whether Miss Quill might spare her a few minutes. It concerns tomorrow, and Lady Winifred." Julian's eyes did not leave Adelaide's face at once. Then he said very quietly, "Go, and when you return, Miss Quill, I believe we must decide whether you are to stand beside me when Blackthorn opens its doors." Adelaide found Miss Harbury waiting in the small withdrawing room off the guest corridor, a lamp beside her and a mending basket untouched in her lap. The younger woman rose at once, and there was no embarrassment in her manner, only purpose. Outside the narrow window the court lay black, with one lantern moving near the stables where men were still at work because Julian had said they must be. Even the house sounded different now. Doors opened, footsteps crossed distant passages. Blackthorn no longer slept like a grave. "I beg your pardon for summoning you," Miss Harbury said, "but I thought it better to speak plainly while there is still time." Adelaide had grown used to plain speech of late. "Then pray do." Miss Harbury folded her hands. "Lady Winifred will come tomorrow whether she is wanted or not. If she sees what I saw this evening, His Grace receiving callers, unmasked, the shutters open even by half, she will not keep it to herself. By this time next week, the whole county will know." Adelaide felt that truth settle heavily, though it did not surprise her. "Yes, and if you are beside him when it happens," Miss Harbury continued, "they will know of you, too. They will ask who you are, why you are always near him, and what authority placed you there. Some will be kind, some will be coarse under polite phrases. All will be curious." There was only honesty from one woman to another. Adelaide lowered her eyes to the fire. I had supposed as much. Miss Harbury hesitated, then spoke more softly. I do not say this to frighten you away, only because men of rank often forget that the scrutiny they endure by birth may ruin a woman who has not chosen it. Chosen. The word lodged deep. Adelaide had spent years on the far side of that question. Not chosen for marriage, not chosen for beauty, not chosen for any of the bright, ordinary futures that seem to fall into other women's laps while one is busy being sensible. To be useful had become her answer to all of that. Safe, unromantic, manageable. And what would you advise? She asked. Miss Harbury gave a rueful little smile. If I were very prudent, I should advise you to leave before the county has a chance to invent you. If I were honest, she paused, I should say that when His Grace looked to you tonight, it was not as a man looks to a servant merely doing her task. Adelaide felt heat rise to her face. You infer a great deal from one evening. From one evening, no. From many small things visible to any woman who has eyes, yes. That was almost intolerable to hear aloud. Adelaide had guarded herself too long to bear easy hope. Hope was costly. It asked a woman to risk looking foolish in the one place where dignity was often all she had left. When she returned to the library, the moon had shifted higher. Julian was standing where she had left him, one hand upon the mantel, the firelight striking the strong and ruined planes of his face alike. The sight still caught at her heart, not because of the scars now, but because he no longer turned them away from her. He looked up at once. Well? Adelaide closed the door behind her. Miss Harbury believes Lady Winifred will spread the news of your recovery through the county before the week is out. My recovery? The ghost of wryness touched him. I should like to see the physician bold enough to certify it. She meant your reappearance. Yes, I thought as much. He studied her. That is not all. No. He waited. The fire gave a soft crack. Adelaide clasped her hands to keep them from betraying her. She believes that if I remain here and remain near you, I shall be discussed. Julian's expression did not alter, but his attention sharpened. And does that alarm you? It ought to. Ought? She drew one breath. This, too, required plainness. Your Grace, I am not ignorant. I know what I am. I am a woman of 39 with no fortune, no family consequence, and no practice in becoming the object of anyone's notice. It is one thing to sit in your library and read the late Duchess's letters. It is another to place myself where every idle mouth may shape a story from my presence. He said nothing at first. That was almost worse than interruption. Then he crossed the space between them, not hastily, but with that same grave decision he had shown in the gallery door, at the schoolroom bed, at the window. When he stopped before her, his voice was very low. Miss Quill, he said, if the world begins to speak of you, it will do so because I have given it cause. Her heart turned over. She lifted her eyes to his. That is precisely what I fear. For one suspended moment, neither moved. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, the great hall clock began to strike the hour. And when the final note faded, Julian said, Then tomorrow, before Lady Winifred arrives, I must tell you what cause I mean to give. Morning came cold and bright, with frost whitening the terrace balustrade, and a thin sun finding its way through more windows at Blackthorn than it had been permitted to touch in years. Adelaide had scarcely slept. Julian's last words had followed her into the dark and remained there, turning slowly, like a key not yet used. Before Lady Winifred arrives, I must tell you what cause I mean to give. She had gone over the sentence in every shade of caution and hope until both were exhausted. Mrs. Vale came early with hot water and a face so composed it might have belonged to a woman carrying ordinary domestic news. "His Grace asks that you walk in the south garden before breakfast," she said. "The winter sun reaches the old glass house there. He thought it warmer than the library." Adelaide's hands tightened on the bed coverlet. "Did he say why?" "No, Miss Quill." A pause. Then, with rare gentleness, "I do not believe the reason requires much guessing." The south garden had once been the pride of the late Duchess. Adelaide had seen it only at a distance until now, a walled enclosure half reclaimed from neglect, with stone paths rimed in frost and espaliered fruit trees sleeping against brick. Beyond it stood the old glass house, many of its panes replaced after storms, some still clouded with age. Inside, the morning light was clear and pale, touching overturned pots, dormant vines, and the first green points of forced bulbs pushing through dark soil. The air held that mingled scent of damp earth, cold glass, and leaf mold that belongs only to gardens in winter. Julian was already there. He stood with his back to the doorway, looking out through the mottled panes toward the orchard. He had no mask on. The light fell across his face without mercy, and now without refusal. He wore a dark coat buttoned high against the chill, and one hand rested on the back of a wooden bench as if he had placed it there to steady some inward resolve. When he heard Adelaide enter, he turned at once. "You came. You asked me to." "Yes." A faint breath left him. "And for once I am glad of obedience." The line might have been teasing in another man. In Julian, it was grave enough to be more moving. For a moment, neither spoke. A drop of condensation slid down one pane and fell softly to the stone. Somewhere in the wall, a robin scratched among dead leaves. Adelaide thought, absurdly, that if she moved too quickly, she might break whatever delicate thing had drawn them both to this place. At last, he said, "Miss Quill, I have spent 10 years arranging my life so that nothing unforeseen might enter it. No voices, no visitors, no light beyond what I could govern. I thought it discipline. In truth, it was fear made method." She said nothing. He needed no prompting now. "When you came here," he continued, "I believed you would be another necessary inconvenience, a pair of eyes to move over paper, a voice to carry my mother back to me." His mouth altered, the old dryness touched with self-reproach. "I did not foresee that the same voice would call me back as well." Adelaide's breath caught. He took one step nearer. "You have shown me my mother's mercy, my duty, my house, my tenants, my own face in daylight. Every threshold I have crossed this month, I crossed first because you stood there without flinching." She had no shield against words spoken so plainly. 39 years of sensible renunciation offered no defense at all. "Your Grace," she began, but he shook his head. "No, if I am to speak, let me be accurate for once before courage fails me." His gaze did not leave hers. "When I said the world might speak of you because I had given it cause, I meant this. I do not wish you to stand beside me as companion, reader, or convenient witness. I wish you there because Blackthorn feels altered in your absence, and because when I think of any room opening before me now, Ashcombe Court, the chapel, the tenants' meeting, even this glass house in winter, I think first whether you will be in it." Adelaide's hands had gone cold inside her gloves from the terrible tenderness of being seen where she had long expected never to be seen at all. "I am not a young woman," she said, and hated at once how small the words sounded beside what he had offered. "No? I have no beauty to recommend me. I know it." A startled sound escaped her, half laugh, half wounded protest, and for the first time that morning a true warmth came into his eyes. "You have honesty," he said. "Do not ruin it now with fishing for flatteries. I am too exact to give. I know what you are, Adelaide. that is the whole matter. Her name, spoken so quietly in that glass-lit space, seemed to alter the air itself. Before she could answer, footsteps crunched across the frosted path outside. Mrs. Vale appeared at the garden gate, breath visible in the cold. "My lord," she called, trying and failing to keep urgency from her tone. "Lady Winifred's carriage has just turned into the drive." Lady Winifred's arrival shattered whatever private sanctuary the glass house might have offered. The rattle of wheels on the gravel drive, the call of the groom, the brisk opening of the great front doors, each sound came clear even through the garden wall, as if the outside world had chosen that precise instant to remind Blackthorn it had claims of its own. Julian did not curse, he did not retreat. Yet Adelaide saw with painful clarity the effort it cost him to let the moment go unfinished. He turned to Mrs. Vale first. "Take Lady Winifred to the blue drawing-room. Light the fire if it is not already lit." "It is, my lord." "Good. Keep her there 10 minutes. Mrs. Vale's brows rose the smallest degree. 10, your grace?" "Not 11. She will fill them." The old housekeeper gave the briefest nod and went at once, skirts brushing frost from the path as she moved. Julian turned back to Adelaide. The winter light, filtered through old glass, fell full across his face. Never again hidden from her, she thought with a sudden fierce ache. "I had meant to say this without interruption," he said. "You still may." "No." His mouth altered, that dry gravity in it yielding to something more bare. "I cannot say it in fragments. Not to you." The words struck deep because they were not polished. He was not a man made for pretty speeches. Whatever he meant to offer would be difficult, exact, and therefore all the more dangerous to her heart. He held out his hand, an invitation. Adelaide looked at it for a moment too long. 39 years of caution do not vanish because a winter garden is touched by morning light. She had spent too much of her life learning not to presume. A woman passed over often enough becomes careful even in hope, especially in hope. Yet he waited. At last she placed her gloved hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with grave steadiness. "When Lady Winifred sees us," he said, "she will form conclusions. She will publish them by supper." A faint breath, almost laughter. "Yes, that is her charitable gift to society. Then let her conclusions be correct." Adelaide's pulse turned unsteady beneath his touch. He took one step nearer. "I do not ask you to endure gossip for my convenience, nor to remain because this house has grown used to your voice. I ask because I do not mean you to leave it." Her throat tightened. "Julian." It was the first time she had spoken his name without title, and they both heard it. The air in the glass house seemed to alter around them. He did not release her hand. "I know what the world will say, that I am damaged, grateful, impressionable, absurd, that you are prudent, ambitious, late to fortune. Let it speak. I have obeyed shadows long enough." His gaze held hers with a force that made evasion impossible. "What I require to know is whether the thought of standing beside me repels you or only frightens you." There was no refuge in false modesty now. He had given her too much honesty for that. "It frightens me," she said, "because if I believe you, I must believe something for myself that I put away years ago." His expression changed then, not triumph, not relief, but a tenderness so quiet it nearly undid her. "And what is that?" "That I may still be chosen." The confession left her defenseless. She felt it at once. The cold glass house, the damp scent of earth, the pale bulbs pressing toward bloom beneath the benches, all of it sharpened around the silence that followed. Julian lifted her hand a little, not to his lips, not theatrically, simply as if to feel the reality of it. "You are," he said. Before anything more could be spoken, a footman came hurrying across the frosted path from the terrace door, red-cheeked with cold and alarm at his own errand. "Your Grace," he called, then stopped short on seeing them so near together. "Beg pardon. Lady Winifred would not wait in the blue drawing-room. She has gone herself in search of you." Julian's jaw tightened. "Where?" The footman swallowed. "Toward the library, Your Grace, and Miss Harbury, hearing her come, has tried to delay her, but I fear she may already have found the open curtains." They reached the library together, breath white in the cold passage, and found Lady Winifred exactly where one might have expected her, standing in the middle of the room she had no business entering, gloved hands clasped upon the head of her cane, Miss Harbury hovering at her elbow with the look of a woman who had done her best against a force of nature and lost. The curtains stood partly open. Winter light filled the space enough to show everything that had once been hidden. Lady Winifred turned. She saw Julian first, barefaced, then Adelaide beside him. Her sharp, bright eyes widened, not with horror, but with that fierce satisfaction known only to people who believe Providence sends them material. She dropped a curtsy, recovered, and said with alarming cheer, "Your Grace, I knew I should not have driven over for nothing." Miss Harbury closed her eyes briefly. Julian did not retreat into shadow. He came fully into the room, the scarred half of his face plain in the daylight, and for one charged instant, Adelaide understood that the next words he spoke would shape the whole of her remaining life. "You have come at an opportune moment, Lady Winifred," he said. There was something in his voice she had not heard before. Authority, yes, but settled now upon a living center rather than a hollow one. He crossed to Adelaide, and, before any of them could mistake his intent, took her hand. Lady Winifred's brows shot upward. "This is Miss Adelaide Quill," Julian said. "She came here in my mother's service, and has rendered greater service to this house than any person in it, myself included. Since the county appears likely to concern itself with my affairs again, you may save it the trouble of invention. If Miss Quill will consent, she is to be my wife." The room went utterly still. Adelaide felt the blood leave and return to her face in one rush. He had done it. He had placed her in the open, before witnesses, and spoken as a duke ought when he means to be obeyed by the world and by his own fear. Lady Winifred, to her eternal credit, was silent for nearly 3 whole seconds. Then she said, very softly, "My dear child, do consent." At that, some impossible tightness in Adelaide's chest gave way. She turned to Julian. His hand around hers was steady, but his eyes were not untroubled. For all his public certainty, he had given her the right to answer freely. She saw that plainly. It was the final proof of him. "Yes," she said. It was only one word. It altered Blackthorn more completely than fire ever had. The rest passed with a kind of solemn brightness. Lady Winifred kissed Adelaide's cheek without waiting to be asked, and declared herself honored to have arrived precisely at the useful moment. Miss Harbury laughed outright in relief. Mrs. Vale, summoned soon after, wept without disguise. Reverend Harbury offered the gravest blessing. And before noon, Julian gathered the principal household in the morning room, Dawson chastened, the butler unmoved in face and profoundly moved everywhere else, the housekeeper, the chaplain, even Hale from the yard smelling of cold air and timber, and spoke the matter again with the same plainness. Adelaide was not hidden. She stood beside him and was named there, before the people whose world would most immediately change because she had been chosen at last. By spring, the cottages were roofed in sound slate. The west gallery was aired and repaired without pretending it had never burned. The east shutters opened each morning as a matter of course. In the library, the letters were returned at last to their ribbons and boxes, no longer instruments of torment, but a mother's final labor completed. Some evenings Adelaide still read aloud, not because grief demanded a borrowed voice, but because habit, once made tender, becomes one form of home. In the old glass house, where bulbs had pressed through cold soil while two lives changed course above them, the first narcissus opened on the morning of their wedding. Small, pale, and utterly certain, it had no knowledge of how long the winter had been. It only knew the glass had finally let in enough day. That afternoon, the library windows stood uncurtained, and on the table by Julian's chair lay a woman's gloves beside his mother's last letter, both left there as naturally as if they had always belonged. If this story stayed with you, you're welcome to leave a word or two below. And if you'd like another long tale when evening comes, you know where to find this channel.